Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone, my name is Novelina Filzah and I would like to do a presentation about narrative analysis in linguistic research. So the first one that I would like to talk about is the study of narrative. Defining narrative. The term narrative is often used interchangeably with story, life story, account, discourse, narration, and tale with little or no difference in meaning. Narratives are usually constructed around a core of facts or life events and records human experience through the construction and reconstruction of personal stories. Leboeuf and Weltsky in 1967 described narrative as any sequence of clauses which contains at least one temporal juncture. The notion of temporal juncture is central to their definition as it is a distinguishing feature of narratives that creates a link between the sequence of events and the clauses that describe them. Leboeuf and Weltsky put their focus on the sequence of events. For example, there is narrative clauses, she left the house and he called the police as the basic unit in personal narratives and indicated that the order of clauses represents the sequence of events as they actually happened. If, for instance, the clauses in she left the house and he called the police were changed into he called the police and she left the house, they would be implying a different sequence of events and thus a different narrative. Next, analyzing narrative. There are two analyses here, which are componential analysis of narrative and functional analysis of narrative. Componential analysis of narrative aims to identify the basic structure of a narrative and to examine the sequence of its clauses. This sequential arrangement can then be used to determine the functions of the clauses, while functional analysis of narrative mainly examines the purposes of narratives. And this analysis approach studied how narrators represent or interpret the world, how they represent self and others, and how they construct their gendered, ethnic, or class identities. And this is a part of componential analysis of narrative. So there are three types of clauses which maintain the strict temporal sequence. The first is free clauses, which can be displaced without disrupting the match between the clause and the event sequence and are normally used to provide background information about a central action or situation in the narrative. The second is coordinate clauses. They can have a number of complex relations to the narrative sequence. And the last is restricted clauses. They are less fixed to the sequence than a narrative clause, but less free to be displaced than a free clause. Here I provide some clauses for the examples. The first three clauses, lines 1 until 3, you can read it in the slide. They set the scene for the narrative, the situation, the action, and the characters. While the fourth and the fifth lines are narrative clauses. And clauses 6 and 7 are examples of coordinate clauses related to the narrative clause, which immediately precedes them. And lines 13 and 14 offer an example of a restricted clause, which could have been placed before the narrative clause, for instance, line 5, without affecting the logical sequence of the narrative, but the word either at the end of it restricts its positions in the sequence. The next is the part of functional analysis of narrative. Cheshires in 2000, study of narratives and gender in adolescent friendships follows an analytical framework which consists of three basic components, which are the tale or we can say as the narrative, the teller or the narrator, and the telling or the act of the narrations could be boys and girls. So Cheshire demonstrates not only that the way the tale structures experience differs between boys and girls, and that the way in which a teller represents self and also differs according to gender, but also, and probably most interestingly, that the telling is used by boys and girls for different purposes. Cheshire shows that in most of the boys' narratives, there are elements of inclusion of other speakers and construction of family narrative which are used to create a sense of group identity through a telling of story. This sometimes results in narratives being told in a disorganized way, but it reinforces the idea that boys are more interested in the telling of the story than in the story itself. Girls, however, narrate stories of a more individual nature and are not so inclined to co-construction, but produce narratives which are more coherent. This, such as Cheshire's, seems to emphasize the idea that girls are more interested in the story than in the act of narration. And then next is narrative networks. This was first used by Bierman and his colleague named Stovall in 2000. Narrative networks used to describe how the structural elements in a narrative create an internal network of meanings which supports the holistic interpretation of a story. The networks shows not only what the stories, the text, the artifacts, and the core of narrative have in common, but also how they differ, thus broadening the analytical perspective and helping tensions and contradictions emerge during the analysis. Narrative networks can help highlight the links between the local and social functions that narratives represent. Then the next is theoretical principles in narrative networks. Narrative networks can be placed within critical discourse analysis, which establishes a dialogic connection between critical social science and linguistics in a single theoretical and analytical framework. Narrative networks provide a framework for the critical analysis of narratives that attempts to accommodate some of the criticism presented in the analytical approach using critical discourse analysis. Uh, narrative narrative networks provide a framework for the critical analysis of narratives that attempts to accommodate some of the criticism. The framework is based on the following four theoretical principles below, which are representation, falsifiability, derivation, and validation. In representation, the narrative chosen for analysis should represent the problem rather than how the analyst theorizes and interprets it. It should also represent the values, norms, and behavior of all those involved in the social problem. Misrepresentation can be avoided by creating a network of representative texts, documents, and artifacts around the core of the narrative. And in falsifiability, used to prevent argumentative circularity. The analysis of the narrative should consider counter-evidence, avoiding at the same time selective partiality of evidence. And in derivation, interpretation of the narrative should highlight the relationship between the narrative and its immediate context of production and consumption, as well as the network of actors and artifacts that surrounds it. And in validation, explanation of significance of the core narrative in relation to the problem it represents should be endorsed by those involved in producing and consuming all the text analyzed. The use of participant validation, and thick ethnographic observation can facilitate this process. So here is a diagram of the process of constructing a narrative network. We can see at the diagram that there are 4 stages here, but stages 1 are divided again into A and B. And in its stages, there will be some steps or actions, and in total, there will be 14 steps or action that we have to take in constructing a narrative network. And I will I will divide this diagram into some slides so that I can explain it more detail. So stage 1A, selecting emerging issues in core narratives. In stage 1, it is called a data collection process. So there are 3 steps here. The first is select a social issue or problem that you want to examine. For instance, oppression, social exclusion, immigration, gender inequality, or something interesting issues that are happening in your environment. And steps 2, collect narratives that may illustrate the issue or problem you want to examine. This could be narratives in the workplace, in school, in the surrounding. And the third is analyze the narratives in search of emerging issues. This might be something like how immigrants. So in this book, the process show about the topic about immigrants. So I will also explain about the immigrants topics. So in the step 3, you can use like how immigrants deal with legal issues, how women bank managers may have to struggle against double standard, and etc. And in stage 1B, building the networks, it is also included in data collection process. There are 5 stages here. 5 steps or actions. The first is prepare questions to investigate through interviews based on the emerging issues, like how do immigrants find the legal systems, and then how are opportunities for promotion distributed in banking, and etc. And the 5th is interview other people who are networked with the core narrators. It might be the narrator's colleagues, friends, families, best friends, etc. And step 6, analyze their interview answers in search of supporting as well as contradictory evidence. We can use, we can use like immigrants find it hard to understand legal issues and the language of legal documents or something like that. And in 7, collect documents and artifacts that may throw new or different light on the issues investigated. This might be pictures, historical documents, or chart, etc. And the last, step 8, use the issues you identified to build up the narrative networks around them. I'm sorry. And then jumping into the data analysis process in stage 2, which are analyzing textual and semantics patterns. There are 3 steps. The first is identify internal textual relations. And then you can use collocation or colligation, which trigger the main meanings in the narratives. And step 10, identify the semantic value of textual relation. Something like the semantic prosody of main phrases in the previous step. And step 11, decide how textual and semantic relationship restrict interpretation. And the next is data interpretation. So based on the restriction identified in the previous step, how do the issues relate to the emergent context? You can use questions like, what do the emerging issues from the analysis tell you about their context of reaction? For instance, are the difficulties some immigrants face when dealing with legal issues their own individual problem, or do they reflect a wider problem in the immigration systems? And the last is data explanation. There are two steps. The first is seek participant validation for your interpretations. You can use questions like, how do they see your findings? Do their interpretation support or challenge your findings? And then the last steps or actions in the process of constructing narrative networks is establish a link between the issues you have interpreted and related issues in society at large. You can use like, what are the social patterns that these local issues illustrate? What do they represent? What do they challenge? What voices are represented or silenced? And etc. So in conclusion, it is essential to examine the link between the narrative-local performance and the social patterns such performances represent. We need to expand the analytical possibilities offered by local narratives by networking them with the local as well as global social context where they are produced and consumed. As an analytical framework, narrative network can help us shift this. But we also need to adopt a critical approach to the analysis of narratives more broadly. We need an approach that focuses not only on the text itself, but also on the mechanism, actors, and resources involved in its production and consumption. Thank you. That's all for my presentation. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.